Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this edition of Wine, Women, and Words. Diana here. And joining us today, we have Natalie Haynes, and we're here to talk about her book, Stoneblind. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I feel bad I haven't got any wine, but I've underprepared again.
You know, it's okay. It's 11 a.m. where I'm at, so I'm drinking coffee.
I don't have that excuse. It's fully evening in London where I am. So yeah, I should be quaffing wine all over the place. I just failed to prepare again.
Coughing wine. I love that. I feel like I'm going to steal that. Not gonna lie. So your book, Stoneblind, was wonderful. It was such a pleasure reading. And for those who aren't familiar with the book, could you give us a little bit of a synopsis?
Yeah, sure. It's the story of Medusa and all the characters that sort of impact on her life. She is, I think we tend to think of her as a monster who lives alone and turns people to stone. And I had written about her from a non-fiction angle before, and it kind of annoyed me that that's how we thought of her, because she isn't really a monster. She's a gorgon, so she's a sort of creature, but not really a monster. She's one of three sisters, and we didn't often think about those. I didn't think it gave her a family context that we didn't often have. So there are three gorgons: Medusa, Steno, and Euryale. And she doesn't turn anyone to stone. So as monsters go, she's a really nice one. And as soon as I sort of thought about it, that you could turn people to stone by looking at them, but you don't. I can't find any source from ancient Greece or Rome where she deliberately and knowingly kills someone. There are plenty of sources where her head is used as a weapon after she's been murdered, but that's not the same thing at all. I thought, well, loads of effort must go into not killing people if you can kill them just by looking at them. And also how incredibly lonely that must be, because you couldn't look at anything without destroying it. So you'd have to be blinded either by darkness or by, covering your eyes. And so in Greek, Medusa, her name means guardian, the one who protects or watches. And I thought, I'm pretty sure nobody thinks of her like that anymore. They think of her as a monster. And I'd like it if they didn't think of her as a monster anymore. I'd like it if they thought of her as a protector. And so I thought I would tell her story as a sister and a guardian and a daughter, and give her I keep wanting to say humanity, but gorgonity, give her gorgonity back.
Well, in a lot of ways, I feel like there was this element of humanity, because we see, as you said, the monster version of her, and especially in the modern times, we see this woman who has been tragically wronged, and we just look at the terrible things that happened. I don't think it's really giving out spoilers, especially how many thousands of years.
I mean, a couple, like 3.
I mean, come on. If you haven't looked up the history by now, then really, what are you doing? I mean, she's a woman who had been raped, and we look at the negative side of things. And I feel like with this book, when it really shows that when we look at a woman who's been through a sexual assault, we see the negative side. We see the terrible things that she had gone through.
Yeah, we see the assault before we see the woman. I think that's you're exactly right. And I was really keen to examine, I mean, I think she is literature's first monstered rape survivor, and I'm using monster in its literal verb sense now, meaning she is rendered a monster. She's not just, and I mean, we still do this metaphorically now, of course, as societies. We often disbelieve people who tell us they've been sexually assaulted. Sometimes, as we've seen with some quite high profile cases, it takes literally dozens of women giving the same kind of evidence about sexual assault at the hands of a powerful man before it occurs to anyone that that powerful man might indeed be as these women have described him. And in the process of that reappraisal, it tends to be the case that the women who are prepared to stand up and say, actually, this person assaulted me, are rendered monsters. They can't be believed because this, they must be lying because that. And And with Medusa, it's really literal. She's sexually assaulted in a temple, and the punishment for that sexual assault isn't meted out on the person who assaults her, or the god in this instance who assaults her. It's meted out on the victim of the assault. And it is such a potent image that, having been abused, you then have to kind of wear the mark of that abuse. I found it really compelling, actually, to write about. And the book has been out in the UK, where I am, for 5 months. I think that's true. And I didn't realize quite how many chords it would strike with people, in a way which I probably should have thought about. But in order to get through your day, I think you can kind of look at the numbers. And I've written about and thought about the numbers of people who survive sexual assault plenty of times, but you don't really think about the way that the thing that you're writing might reach them. So it was quite a lonely book to write, not least because I wrote it when the UK was locked down. So I couldn't see my family, and I essentially wrote myself a whole new one. But in a way, I wonder if that isolation is one of the reasons. The isolation of the author has probably spilled over into the isolation of the character. I wonder now if that's one of the reasons it's finding resonance with people who feel that they have been isolated by terrible things that have been done to them. I wonder if there's an echo through all these different narratives of feeling like you're on your own and no one else is present who can reach you or hear you. As I say, for lockdown, it was kind of literally true for me. It's certainly metaphorically true for huge, countless numbers of women, every day, every week, every month, every year. So yeah, it felt like a story that I needed to write. Yeah, I hope it's finding the right readers, or maybe I hope the readers are finding it. I'm not sure.
I think both can be true, especially with this book. And it's such a brilliant point about the books that came out after lockdown, where people who were writing books. My last one I wrote during lockdown as well. And I feel like there should be, like, this time period between maybe someday in the future, some literary scholar who's much better at this than I am can look at the books that came out, the books that were written between 2020 and 2021, to see what that change was. Maybe we look at the books from the 1920s that are the lost generation books. Maybe the books from the 2020 time period is going to be something like the COVID era books, or
maybe.
Or
And
maybe
I think
let's have a nicer word than COVID. Let's do the lonely generation books.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And the thing is, I had to give up my performing career, obviously, while London was locked down, while the UK was locked down. And I was a comedian before I was a novelist. So I was a stand-up comic for just over a decade, through my 20s and just into my 30s. And I still perform a lot in the UK. I have a radio series, a podcast called Natalie, Haynes Stands Up for the Classics, where I get to basically tell you funny things about the ancient world. And I couldn't do that, I couldn't perform. And so this book is absolutely, it's full of yearning for all the things we don't have. It's full of heart-rending emotional scenes with families. It's full of scenes where I'm just trying to make you laugh because I haven't got anyone to make laugh. I've got to write some jokes, like it's going to kill me otherwise. So, yeah, I didn't realize quite how intensely I had done it until I handed it in. I'm like somebody who's done their homework, until I submitted the manuscript to my editor. And then the day, you know how it is, you finish a book, and like the day and the day after, you're so elated because this huge weight, like the weight of the heavens on the shoulders of Atlas, you're like, oh, thank God, I've put that world to one side now, and I have a little rest while someone else carries it around for a few days until they send it back with edits. And then the day after that, I realized that I didn't have my new family and friends to play with. I just cried like a lunatic. So, but I suppose you do what you do to survive, right? And as surviving a pandemic goes, inventing a bunch of people to hang out with is probably one of the most benign responses you could have. So I was like, yeah, no, fair enough, that's what I did, I feel okay about it, here we are.
It definitely is one of the healthiest things I think we could have done during the pandemic. I mean, no offense to the people who were baking bread, But I mean, there's the whole calorie thing. We don't have to worry about the calories so much because
I mean, I was still
creating.
eating bread. I want credit for that. I did my
Yes.
part at eating carbs through the pandemic. You're welcome.
Carbs are the ultimate comfort food, really,
So
when it
true.
comes down to it. I feel like my body is made up of 3 things: wine, garlic, and carbs. That's
Oh, interesting. I
yeah.
always tell people my job is basically to process sugar into words. That's pretty
Mm.
well it.
That's about on point too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a wonderful, interesting way to look at writing as well.
Writing and
So
performing. It's always like, give me sugar and then I can do the thing. Okay, now we can go.
so I want to step back for a moment and go to the source, because you've talked about doing the stand-up with the funny things that happened during the Greek times, or mythology, and then you've got this book. What was the inspiration? What made you want to write about Medusa herself?
I wrote a chapter about her in a book called Pandora's Jar that came out in the US last spring, I think. And there are 10 chapters in the book, so I guess each chapter must be about 9,000 words long. And at the end of the chapter, in each of them, I might add, while I was writing it, I'm such a serial monogamist. While I was writing each chapter, I was like, oh, I could write a whole book about this woman. She's so great. And on several of those occasions, I had already written an entire book about that woman. And yet somehow I was like, oh, maybe this would be a great angle. You've already written it. Stop, put it down, walk away. So, you know, I was writing Helen or Penelope from the Trojan War. It's like I literally wrote a novel about the Trojan War called 1,000 Ships. These women have had their moment in your work. It is fine. But with Medusa, I don't know, it was a bit different. I think she was the 4th chapter. I know I shouldn't remember, but obviously I don't. And while I was telling her story, I was kind of shocked. You know, normally, I know quite a lot about Greek myth. You know, I started studying Latin at 12, I think, and ancient Greek at 14. My degree is in Greek and Latin, so I studied classics at Cambridge, UK Cambridge, not America Cambridge. So I've been in this world for a really long time, and yet I kept finding things in Medusa's story where I was like, why didn't I know this? You know, why didn't I know that? And I was like, well, okay, yeah, fine. You know, always thought of her a monster. Now I've sort of changed my opinion. And then when I got to the end of the chapter, I realized I was just fuming about everything that happens to her. And I thought, well, if you're still I've written her 9,000 words. Do you know what I mean? I've done my best to say, this is what happens to her in her myth. And this is what's happened subsequently to her myth as we've moved through time. And I was livid on both counts for her. So if anything, this book comes from a position of really righteous anger, which isn't, you know, generally I'm like, oh, this would be really cool. I think I'll write this. And with Stone Blind, I was like, it is unacceptable that people think of you in this way. I'm going to write it down. And that, you know, I guess if you're so cross about something that is a sort of this miscarriage of justice, as I perceive it, to happen to a character like Medusa, you owe them a book, right? It's like, I've given you 9,000 words. If that's not enough, you need a novel. Okay, well, here we go. So yeah, it really came from a place of wanting to set the record straight in a much more detailed way, a much more emotional way, I suppose, because in Pandora's Jar, you know, it was a sort of nice, light academic-y type study of going, oh, now we examine this and now we consider that and look at this vase painting and have you seen this sculpture? And then this time it's like, we're going to get inside her head and we are all going to suffer. And then we'll all see it from my point of view. And thus the rally begins. So yeah, essentially, it came in from that angle.
And it's such beautiful suffering. Let's just say that. Such
Thank you.
Bittersweet, a wonderful suffering, and the characters, bringing them to life. It was so much fun with her. My favorites were her sisters and Athena. I've always enjoyed Athena, her mythology.
Yeah.
And having it told in that way was so refreshing.
Yeah, she's quite bracing in my version of her. I know some people are like, how could you be so mean to Athena? You go, no, I love her too. But we have to acknowledge that she can be pretty monstrous quite often. And so, you know, she does some terrible, terrible things to characters throughout Greek myth. And I think sometimes we sort of gloss over it because, you know, generally she seems like quite a sort of relatable goddess as goddesses go. But yeah, no, my version of her is having, I mean, I had a lot of fun writing this completely amoral, very bright, but really has no conscience character, because, you know, the gods in Greek myth from Homer onwards really are, you know, they have these incredible powers, but they have absolutely no capacity for self-restraint. And because nothing really matters to them, they have no sense of proportion. So they're like toddlers with superpowers. You know, when they want a thing, they really want it, and if you don't give it to them right now, they're going to kick off. And it's like, oh my god, how did we get to here? But or my goddess, I suppose, how do we get to here? But you know, it's tremendous fun to write, because you very rarely get to write characters who just have absolutely no moral standing whatsoever. And you know, this is the thing that the ancient Greeks were kind of asking questions about. There's a dialogue of Plato's, the Euthyphro, where they're trying to work out if piety, things, you know, is things essentially is expressed in objects or people or behaviors that the gods love, or do the gods love them because they're already kind of independently, objectively pious? And they can't answer the question, because, you know, Euthyphro, this very confident man, says, oh yeah, the things which are pious or godly are things which the gods love, obviously. And Socrates, who he's talking to, says, right, and what about when they love opposite things, like in the Trojan War in Homer? And he goes, I'm gonna need a second. He just, you know, it's just a really difficult question to answer. You know, who do the gods love in the Trojan War? Well, some of them, Hera, Athene, love the Greeks. Some of them, Apollo occasionally, and Poseidon a bit, and Aphrodite definitely love the Trojans. So who's the good side? You know, it's a much more sophisticated poem than I think people sometimes give it credit for, because it correctly identifies that there is no good in a war, really. There's just different kinds of pain. And so it seemed really fun to be able to take this very toxic kind of mindset and say, well, what happens when this kind of character interacts with other characters? And so when we see Perseus in Stone Blind, it's mainly in the company of Athene or Athenian Hermes, or other goddesses like the Graiai and a few more. And it's like, well, okay, you know, what does this little puny mortal look like to them? And the answer is they can't really be bothered to make an effort to understand him. He's going to be dead in a minute anyway. And he's just like a teenager. So they're like, and so that kind of, yeah, it was really interesting finding a way of trying to get them to interact, these gods who live for millennia and therefore, you know, experience almost no change at all, and human beings who change all the time, or mortal creatures in general, because obviously Medusa is a mortal Gorgon. Her sisters are immortal, but she is not. And it's like, well, what happens when creatures that can experience change come into contact with creatures that can't experience change, or can't register that they experience change, because it happens so in such a minuscule way over so long? And you know, the answer is this total culture clash. So yeah, I mean, you know, again, it feels much more contemporary than I really realized. What happens if you have two sets of people who can't really understand each other's point of view? Oh, I don't know, let me just look outside. So yeah.
And it's one of the things that I like to point out, and you are getting, I'm sorry, my dog.
I'm here all day for the dog. I got terrible pet envy because I live in an apartment without any outside space, so I don't have one. And I'm like, every time it's reminding me of lockdown, when, you know, you get onto a meeting and people go, I'm so embarrassed, here's my cat, and you're like, let me see the cat. I just need to see it.
Yes, Lilo seems to think that she is a co-host, but feel free to come over anytime. I have a menagerie, so we've got the dogs, we've got tortoises, we've got a bearded dragon. It's a load of fun.
When you said menagerie, you were not kidding.
No, I was not. There's a reason why I put even in my bio that I have a menagerie, which also includes a husband. So
he came quite low down the list, didn't he? I noticed that. Okay,
yes.
No, that you're not over that whole not being given coffee once vibe. I now accept.
I mean, I hold a grudge. It's been 20 years.
I see it now.
Hold a grudge. Poor man. I'm glad he doesn't normally listen to the podcast.
Yeah, that's
otherwise we'd be
I've
having
seen
a
that
big
adds
discussion.
to the grudge, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, fine. Just don't value my work. No, it's fine.
All right. So anyways, Because I do historical fiction, I'm always interested in the research that goes into.
Yes.
Oh, I nerd out, and I just want to know about the research that you put into this book as well. It's, lots of people like to think that, okay, it's a retelling, but there's so much research that has to go into a retelling, and especially with the mythology itself.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky that the mythology is sort of where I live, because I've been writing about Greek myth for a longish time now, either in nonfiction or in fiction. And so I tend to go back to sources in their original languages. So I use Greek and Latin, which gives me a lot of chances, I think, to try and strip away some of the prejudice or some of the kind of imbalances that we see in Greek myth. I think often comes from the fact that we're working on versions, like usually the versions we are given as children, there's sort of Greek myths for kids, and they're usually written by people who are following a translation which was maybe done in the 19th or 20th century, and often the kind of boring patriarchal values, as I perceive them, come from there, not from the ancient sources, who have loads of their own misogyny, patriarchy. But often the patriarchy that we're experiencing when we see these myths is a modern imposition. So, for example, I don't think anyone ever hesitates to think in the modern world of Perseus as the hero and Medusa as the monster. But if you look at our ancient sources, you get a much, much more nuanced picture of it. Gorgons are presented to us as grotesque or extreme. And particularly their earliest forms in art, Gorgoneia, just a Gorgon head. These often have really animalistic features, so a very wide mouth with a lolling tongue, often a beard, tusks, snakes for hair, as we're expecting, and that in itself also looks a bit like a lion's mane. The tusks are like wild boar. And so it seems pretty likely that in their earliest iterations, these strange faces or heads or masks, depending on how you prefer to define them, we find them in liminal spaces. We see them on the walls of houses. They were found on the outside of temples. So it seems that they had a dual function, that they were both scaring away people you didn't want in your home or your temple, but also protecting the people inside. And that's also true, for example, in the Iliad, Agamemnon has a Gorgon head, a Gorgoneion, painted on his shield. Well, maybe that's just to scare the enemy, but it seems much more likely, given it's specifically the shield that is painted on, that it's to protect him as well. So Gorgons have this dual function really from the very beginning. And in one ancient source, we're told that when Asclepius, the god of healing, is learning his healing powers, he's given 2 small vials of blood by Athene. Each one contains 1 drop of blood from Medusa's body, one from the left-hand side of her body, one from the right. The one from I think it's the left-hand side one. The one from the left is lethal, deadly. It can poison you in a second and kill you. And the one from the right-hand side of her body is called soterian. It can save you, revive you, bring you back from the dead. So Gorgons have this dual existence in Greek myth, and especially in early Greek myth. And Perseus is actually quite a late addition to the story of Gorgons. We see Gorgon heads and then full-bodied Gorgons before we ever see Perseus in any version of their narrative. So I think in the modern world, we've tended to assume that it was a sort of archetypal hero overcomes monster narrative, but actually it's much more likely to be the other way around. They have these Gorgon heads everywhere, then they get full-bodied Gorgons, and I think most probably the Greeks, inveterate storytellers, looked at these numerous heads around them and then at the full-bodied Gorgons and tried to work out how they've been separated, and that's where someone with a sword comes into the story. So having written 1,000 Ships, which told the story of the Trojan War, I did loads and loads of literary research for that, because there are masses of sources about the Trojan War from Homer and Euripides and Aeschylus and Quintus Mannaeus, and lots and lots of different sources of varying levels of obscurity. But with Gorgons, there's a reasonably long narrative version in Ovid's Metamorphoses. There are mentions in Pindar, in Hesiod, but they're super scanty. Hesiod says there are 3 Gorgons, Steno, Euryale, and Medusa, and the first 2 are immortal and the third one is mortal. What a wretched fate. Moves on. You're like, dude, I'm going to need a bit more than that. Did you write anything else? But what there are is masses and masses of incredible vase paintings and sculptures. And And so a lot of this book was written for the first time for me, really, was written from visual sources more than literary sources. And some of those are some of the most sympathetic portrayals of Medusa that I think there have ever been. There's an incredibly beautiful hydria, a water jug in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which shows the moment where Perseus kills Medusa. And in this version, he's sort of sneaking up on her. He's on his tiptoes. And the reason is that she's asleep. And in our ancient sources, she is usually asleep when he kills her. And I think in the modern world, we've got this notion of this brave hero striding off to find a terrifying monster in the film Clash of the Titans from the 1980s, showing my age. Then she's armed with a bow and arrow and he's gone after, and it's like, yeah, okay, hero versus monster. But in our ancient sources, and you can really see on this vase painting, there's quite an ambivalent response to the way Perseus is acting. Then it looks a lot like what it is, which is a man sneaking up on a sleeping woman with his sword, which has a kind of curved blade. It's got a harpe in Greek. His sword is curving around her neck. It looks incredibly violent and cruel. Her sleeping eyes are just shown by two beautiful little semicircular lines to show her closed eyelids. And in this version, it's a 5th century pot. She doesn't have snakes for hair. She's got just black ringlets, beautiful curls. So she's not a monstered Gorgon at this point. She looks like a completely human creature, except for the fact that she has wings, but her face is completely, and her hair, completely human. And so it looks like a really ambivalent response. If you compare it to the way that vase painters tend to show someone like Heracles, he always looks like he's a whale of a time when he's performing a labor. You see him choking a Nemean lion, and they're so brilliant, the endless vase paintings and sculptures of this scene, that there are like memes of Hercules trying to feed his caterpillar, and because he's always trying to choke the lion. I was like, and honestly, it is uncanny if you've ever tried to feed a caterpillar. But they look fun. It looks like the vase painter was having fun. It looks like Hercules is having, difficult fun, but fun. I guess the cat doesn't look like it's having a nice time, but we are who we are. And then you look at this vase painting with Perseus and Medusa, and it's like, oh yeah, I don't think I'm supposed to be thinking, what a brave hero. I think I'm supposed to be having a really ambivalent response, which is, look at this guy who's wearing a cap that makes him invisible that he's borrowed from Hades, shoes that make him super fast that he's borrowed from Hermes. He's got the sword that's curving around her neck that's borrowed from Zeus. And he's looking behind him to Athene, who's offering him advice. How many gods are going to gang up on this one sleeping girl? Mm. And so it did feel like a really interesting way of praising him, because obviously the fact that he's got help from all these different gods means that he's really favored as the son of Zeus. He's really favored. But the other way of looking at it is, why does he need so much help? Just how helpless is he himself? We look at Hercules doing all these impossible labors, often with the goddess Hera throwing extra obstacles, in his way. And he always looks like he's coping just fine. And then here's Perseus, and he needs all these extra deities to kind of queue up and help him out. And it's like, well, he's obviously really favored, but he's also kind of hopeless. And so I felt that tension, which was in the artwork rather than in a text, would be the most interesting part of his story to play with. So yeah, it was a really, I mean, as always, how this goes. I spent ages studying the landscape of Libya in the Bronze Age, because, Africa became a lot hotter and drier through I'm never good at this, second millennium BCE. And so I kind of wanted the landscape, because the Gorgons live on the coast of Libya. I wanted it to feel kind of vaguely familiar if you knew that part of the world now, but I also wanted to kind of tip a hat to the fact that it was different then. And there's quite a lot of that going on. Some of the locations had to be completely invented by me, not least because we couldn't travel when I was writing it. So I couldn't just, trot off to the different places which different authors give us as the location of Phlegra, where the Gigantomachy, the great battle between the gods and the giants, took place. Some people say it's in northern Greece, some people say it's in Cumae, southern Italy. One author says there are loads of different locations for it. It was sort of multi-battlefield battle. And it's like, oh, okay. And in the end, of course, when you can't travel, as we couldn't at the time, I did just have to look for images online until I could find one where I felt like that that battle could take place, because there was the right kind of amount of space, and it felt like a good, like somewhere you'd pick for a scrap between giants and gods, and then I set it there.
Yeah, that's when you're talking about locations, it's so wrong accord with me, because I was writing my last one during the pandemic, so I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to Italy. My Italy trip had gotten scrapped like everybody else's travel plans for 2020. And we were, as authors, having to come up with, it's especially when you're looking at history, you're not just looking at, you know, your setting, like you would have, like if you're writing a romantic comedy, for example, or a mystery set during the present time, you'd be like, okay, yeah, I can go on Google and look up this little sleepy town. This is where I'm going to set it. When we're doing something that's set in like in history, like 100+ years from now, it's not just, okay, let's bring up this pretty setting. Okay, we have to also imagine what it's going to look like a couple 100 years ago. Like I guess I was lucky because I was 18th century. You were like so you had to really go back and look at
did have to really go back, but you know, I spent a lot of time studying this period, so I have a huge library of books, considering how small this apartment is. There is a really quite highly functional classics reference library lurking in here. I dare not turn this around. We're about to get crushed by a huge pile of books in every direction. Like the only clear space that there is. But and you know, sometimes there were just those kind of little like researcher miracles, where I realized to write the scene we were just talking about, the big action sequence in an early-ish part of the book, the Gigantomachy, this huge battle between gods and giants, which is where Athene develops her taste for war, as I tell it anyway. But in any source, it's one of the earliest battles she's attested as being part of, the Titanomachy before it, and then the Gigantomachy. And there's an incredible, gigantic sculpture called the Pergamon altar, which is currently held in Berlin at the Pergamon Museum. And I had been to Berlin and seen this sculpture, and it's just massive. I mean, huge, 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 hugely detailed images, frieze of gods and giants fighting, and you know, the most incredible details. Like one set of goddesses are lobbing like a bowl full of snakes at giants, and you're like, yeah, if that works, why not? Go on, go right there. I would imagine most people have come with like a sword or a spear, but yeah, bowl of snakes, why not? You do you, go on. Okay. And so I really wanted to have properly detailed images of this incredible altar, so that I could steal sequences from this very, very beautiful and incredibly important set of sculptures and put them in the book, partly because it would save me inventing them for myself, and partly because it is such a lovely kind of prize for people who've been to see it, and they'll be like, oh my god, I've seen this bit. But mainly because it's just a fantastic piece of art, and who doesn't want to include everything when they, you know, are at least at the research stage. And so I couldn't go to Berlin to see it again. There were no good kind of really detailed photographs online. There were lots and lots of pictures like tourists would take, which is perfectly fair enough, but not that were in the detail that I needed. And at the time I was writing this, the UK had just finally, after much, you know, international derision, which we hadn't fully incurred, we'd finally left the EU, the large trading bloc on our doorstep, which most people would call Europe. And so there were huge difficulties trying to get goods in and out between Britain and the European Union. And so I found eventually this book in German, but it had really great photographs. And so it didn't matter that I did Greek instead of German, because I needed the pictures. And so I was like, well, London is locked down and I can't leave it. Berlin is locked down and I couldn't get into the museum anyway, so probably no one is there, and I've got to order the book from the museum to get it. And also, even if there was anyone there, which there won't be because everywhere is locked down, they won't be able to get it to me because we've basically just closed our borders. So I mean, I'll order it, but who knows what will happen. I'll tell you what will happen. 48 hours later, it was in my hands. I was like, how is this true? This is like magic.
Magic.
oh my God, I don't know who to thank. I kind of want to issue a general thanks to the people of Germany and all couriers for being able to make this work. And so that is why the giant battle scene in Stone Blind has lots of detail in it, is because I could write it, because this book impossibly made its way. It couldn't have come faster if I'd asked them to send it, expedited. I don't know how this has happened. I'm delighted.
Well, we're definitely at our half hour, but I have one last question, because Michelle and I have this semi scientific survey that we do with all of our authors.
Yep.
See, for myself, I plot out all of my books. Everything has a plot that I always refer back to, and everything is nice and neat and ordered when it comes to planning out my books. However, in my daily life, I'm okay with chaos. Michelle likes to refer to me as the queen of chaos, which is mostly true. And on the flip side, Michelle, she is everything likes to be nice and neat and ordered in her daily life. But when it comes to her writing, whatever shows up that day, whatever the characters have in mind, no plan, what have you. So now I'm going to pose this question to you.
Yes.
Are you a plotter, or like me, or are you a pantser when it comes to your writing?
I'm a plotter, I'm afraid. So I do it less, what's the word I want? I'm less formal about it now, but I pretty much always know where a book is going. My first novel, I had 3 timelines running. 3 golden times. And I had like all the information that I needed to get across in each section of the book, which was written, structured like a play, so it was told in 5 acts. And I had different colored index cards depending on which timeline it was in. And I had all these cards out laid on the floor with pieces of information, and so which scene, which act, which scene it was, and I was kind of moving them around till I finally got. And there was a moment when I looked at it, I think I must have walked away to go and get a glass of water and then come back, and I suddenly had that thing where you're like, oh my God, if there was string between these cards, I would be the serial killer in a film. Like that's the only difference between my wall and the wall of all serial killers and all episodes of all TV. Like, that's it. That's all I'm missing is string. And now I'm not quite as formulaic as that. I think I've got more just developed confidence, or maybe skill, or maybe both. But I do always have a really tight structural kind of plan in mind. And it's planned pretty ruthlessly. So yeah, but I don't live in chaos either, but that's because I've got a small apartment, and I grew up with the tiniest bedroom. I had like the little box room because I'm the younger. And so if you left things on the floor or whatever, then you couldn't get out. It's like, I'm hungry, I need to pick things up. And I'm still like that. So I have a small apartment. So everything is, I know it doesn't sound like it because there are books everywhere, but there are books everywhere because I'm a writer, so they have to be. But yeah, generally I'm extremely tidy.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And for those of you listening, if you want to pick up your copy of Stone Blind, be sure to check our show notes. We will have a link to Bookshop at bookshop.org. And usually Michelle who does this, so I'm going to try not to screw this up, though I am feeling like I screw this up. As always, bookshop.org supports all of our wonderful authors who take the time to join us. It supports the wonderful independent bookstores out there, but most importantly, it also supports this podcast. But thank you, Natalie, so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure, and we look forward to having you again.
Yes, please. I'd love it. Now go and pet your menagerie for me. Brackets, not husband. That would be weird. Absolutely. Thank you. Have a great day. Good night for you. Yes. Yeah.